You must understand, when Sergeant Nathan Victus stepped into the arena that day, over 300 Earth cycles ago, he was stepping into his death sentence. The Elvar had been bred for millennia, then genetically engineered for centuries more, to be perfect. Perfectly optimized bodies. Perfectly optimized minds. We didn't even learn or drill combat techniques any longer. Rather, the optimal sequence of moves and countermoves for every possible scenario had been calculated, formalized, and uploaded into our brains during clonogenesis. I was literally born as a better warrior than any Noldak ever could hope to become, and even though the official claim was that we were fully perfected, each Aelva continued to self-evolve throughout his life, adding gene amplifiers and synthetic adaptations to make himself ever more lethal. So to be invited to compete in the arena was truly little more than a polite invitation to die horribly. A graphic reminder to our many slave races that our power was inexorable. But the humans were unaware of this. They believed, though we had never in fact told them, that if their champion prevailed in the arena, their world would be spared our conquest and our yoke. The transmission in reply to our invitation read as follows. To the Elven High Command, it took them decades to stop calling us that. Earth submits to no conqueror or tyrant, but we have no desire to rob your race of its youth and its future in open warfare. So, if this conflict can be resolved and our freedom secured with minimal bloodshed, then so be it. We accept your challenge. Sergeant Nathan Victus will represent Earth in this contest. Sincerely, General James N. Mattis, Provisional Commander-in-Chief, Nations in Unison for Terran Security. When our Chief Entertainment Officer, colloquially known as our Games Master, had allowed himself a brief snort of laughter at this terse bit of curious bravado, he promptly translated this Sergeant Victus to the arena ship to be fitted with the requisite implants to ensure his bout would be adequately captured and transmitted to all interested viewers. He was also scheduled for a week of training in our best facilities, both to enhance the illusion of a real fight with actual stakes, and to give the Games Master some good training montage footage to intercut with the fight recording and the recap. Let us not deny, he was an impressive physical specimen for a Noldak. His bronze skin may have resulted from genetic heritage originating in the subtropical zones of his planet. Or perhaps from the ritual irradiation that humans of the time practiced. I never did bother to ask the medical technicians if they knew which, but his musculature was undoubtedly a product of personal effort, and were it not for its significantly suboptimal internal configuration, it would not have been out of place on one of my own people, not grotesque and hypertrophic, as many of his species seemed to favor in that era, but dense, compact, and functional. His eyes, as he stepped from the translation pod, bespoke honed alertness, and his movements were more efficient than they had any right to be, given his unoptimized joints and vestibular apparatus. The arena staff reported that he appeared rather intelligent as well, compared to most members of the slave races. Apparently picking up the rudiments of our language, what you lot would know as Old Alvar, even when his interpreter module was inactive. None of that would matter in the end, of course. He was simply outclassed by any Aelvar warrior. But it is only right to acknowledge his merits. When the time arrived for Sergeant Victus to enter the arena proper, the stands were, as you might assume, packed to capacity. Well, nearly. Each of the 17 then current slave races had been instructed to send 10,000 delegates to ensure that the message was not lost on them. And of course the 480,000 seats reserved for Aelvar were all filled, from the lavish boxes reserved for high dignitaries down to the poorest vantages occupied by lower castes who had scrounged enough credits to enter themselves into the ticket lottery, and had gotten lucky. Earth had been invited to send 100,000 representatives, but strangely chose to send fewer than 1/10 that number. We thought perhaps that they knew victory was out of reach and did not wish to harm the morale of their populace, for all the good that would do them. In light of the colossal arrogance the general had displayed in his communique, it had been decided to make a more brutal spectacle of the bout than usual. Instead of a low-caste Aelva seeking simply to earn some scant notoriety, the Games Master had selected as Victus's opponent the subjugator first class, Mael Toth, a veteran of 12 of the 17 prior conquests who had been fighting and self-evolving for over 400 years. No Alvar had lost in anything in more than 6 centuries, but the Games Master wanted to ensure this one would hurt. Both combatants were given only minimal armor, greaves, bracers and a segmented skirt, but were permitted any weapons they chose. Victus was wise enough to forego his Terran firearms, having learned during his week of training that a center mass shot would not kill or even disable an Aelva. Since our circulatory systems operate on distributed peristalsis rather than a single vulnerable heart, and that same musculature also enables us to quickly close any moderately sized perforations to maintain hemostasis. Instead, he bore a simple spear and shield, the primitive martial heritage of both our peoples. Mael Toth, an avid duelist, chose instead a pair of blades the length of a human arm, what we called Peller in Old Aelvar. Seeing Mael Toth, the bladed dancer, step onto the sand surprised and delighted all the Aelvar in the gallery. We knew we were in for a spectacle we would never forget. We were correct in that assessment. As the match began, Victus appeared to take his time, assessing his opponent, feeling him out. Mael Toth allowed him to do so, throwing only half-hearted strikes, easily parried, sometimes even aiming for his foe's armaments rather than his body, a practice I later learned the humans call flinning. When Victus decided to commence in earnest, he first seemed to do quite well, nearly drawing blood several times and taking only shallow cuts in return. It was obvious the Earth delegates thought he was holding his own. Mael Toth was toying with him, humoring him like a mature Koldath wrestling with its young. After several minutes he stepped away, ostentatiously turned his back on his opponent, and theatrically gawped at the crowd, aping what the slave races called a yawn in their various tongues, of course. He called out to the humans watching, "Have you any more? I fear this one may be defective." Victus attempted to take advantage of the apparent opening, cautiously, as a shrewd warrior might well react to such obvious bait. But he hadn't yet made it into spear range when Mile Toth took 2 swift steps towards him, faster than he could react backwards no less. And without turning to look, closing the gap and delivering a whirling backhand that took the human in the chest and launched him 3 spear lengths through the air. He landed, and did not move. "You see," Mile Toth bellowed, "we are not merely a cut above you lowly rabble. We are beyond your reach, we are simply, in every way, better." As one of the great heroes of our past once said, "Pe kalathni indokin pertanantar, ini dalin." The predator does not fight the prey, he simply eats them. The Elvar spectators roared in triumph, and a hush fell over all others. But then, a hush fell over all as the sound dampeners engaged, silencing the audience as they were intended to do, so that no words of the combatants would be drowned out. While everyone had been watching Male Toth, Sergeant Victus had rolled over and raised himself on all fours. "You're right," he croaked, pointing to Male Toth with his spear in one unsteady hand. "You're better than us. Everything that's hard for us is just so easy for you." None of us could hear anything from the Earth delegation, of course. But we could all see the hope drain from their faces as their champion acknowledged what we all knew to be the truth. But Victus hadn't finished. "Still, there are a few things you just plain suck at," he gasped out, spitting a gobbet of crimson blood to one side as he began to catch his breath. As he dragged himself to one knee, bracing against his spear, he growled, "You don't know how to struggle." Male Toth slowly, unconcernedly paced towards him as he continued, "From the minute we're born we have to fight for life, we scream for it. Before we can walk we have to fall on our faces." And here, Male Toth helpfully illustrated, knocking Victus back with a kick to the ribs. A full-strength kick would likely have incapacitated the human permanently at this point, but you see, Male Toth still believed the show we were watching was his. He was still striking with contempt, not lethal intent, and that was his first mistake. This time it took Victus only a moment to rise back to his knee, continuing his sentence as though dismissing a rude interruption. "Again. And again. And again. And you? You just step out of a sludge bucket and have everything handed to you. What do you know of struggle?" Male Toth opened his mouth to scorn his foe before he struck, and that was his second mistake. Victus rose like lightning played backwards, striking not with his spear or shield, but with his head, catching Male Toth in the jaw and causing him to bite off the tip of his own sinuous tongue. As the Elvar subjugator stood there stunned and drooling silvery yucker, the human roared, "You don't know how to suffer." I suppose he must have known that he lacked the core strength with his broken ribs to deliver a decisive thrust, because he pressed forwards with shallow cuts, argent against Male Toth's ivory skin. Every one of us here, he meant humans of course, has known suffering. Our mothers suffer to bring us into the world, and the only thing that brings a permanent end to our suffering is when we leave it. But you! He punctuated his words with a punch of his shield's rim, driving his foe's teeth through his already bloodied lips. "This is your first time even feeling pain. How can you handle suffering?" Shaking his head and disciplining his mind to focus through the unfamiliar pain, Male Toth began to realize his mistake, or so he thought, and skipped lightly backwards, creating distance so that he could have the time he needed to reorient himself and end this fight decisively and above all, indisputably. "So come on you Valtak coward," Sergeant Victus raged on, slamming his spear to his shield in challenge. "Bring it! Because, like one of our heroes once said, I can do this all day." The warriors, for none of us could now deny Victus' recognition as a true warrior, rushed at one another one last time, and it was then that the human did the most curious thing of all. He flung his arms wide, not only making no effort to parry Male Toth's thrust but hurling himself onto the blade and clinching his opponent in what almost appeared to be a lover's embrace. His mumbled words would have been far too muffled and indistinct to be heard, but the implants carried them clearly to the audience. "That's why you'll never beat us." He spat to the side, then growled through silvery lips, "Because you bastards never learned how to lose. So listen up all you fairies in the stands." He pushed Male Toth away, Male Toth's corpse as we soon realized, seeing him fall limply to the ground, his throat a gaping ruin. "On behalf of Earth, same offer to each of you." He fell to his knees, still impaled on the Pella, now drooling more of his own crimson blood than Male Toth's silver, but grinned savagely up towards the luxury boxes and whispered, "P. Helka needy." Even in death he remained upright, leaning on his spear. "That was the day," the old Elva said to her room of rapt young students, Elvar, human Neddekji Polatha Kardin. And even one of the first generation of human Elvar hybrids that I watched the Elvar Empire fall. Oh, it was another few decades before we actually admitted it, and over a century before the last pockets of revanchist rebels were brought to heel. But most of us knew, in our bones, that things would never be the same, and from that day, the unofficial policy of High Command was to leave the humans alone. A few raids here and there so we could still say we were in the process of subjugating them, but never enough to compel them to respond in full force. A few decades later we signed a treaty of amity, promising full and perpetual freedom for Earth and any properly registered colonies thereof. Now some of you are probably thinking like the revanchists did, and that's not inherently a bad thing, mind you. You're wondering why we couldn't have simply adapted, taken into account the humans' difficulty to kill and their tendency to use unpredictable and unorthodox tactics, trained or gene-edited pain resistance. Surely we were strong enough to beat them through naked force, if nothing else, right? Well, we're getting to that. You see, from there we began trading, and from there we began socializing. And we realized more and more each year that Sergeant Nathan Victus had been right. Because they weren't perfect, humans had to struggle. Because they had to struggle, they learned sacrifice. They learned invention and innovation, in ways that our mere drive for improvement could never have achieved. They learned sheer goddamn grit, as they put it. We had none of that. And unless they could teach it to us, we would stagnate, perhaps not right away, perhaps not even by now, 3 centuries later. But eventually, our improvement would have hit a wall. And we would have come up against a stronger threat that would have crushed us as we once crushed others. And once we realized that, well, we began to realize that perhaps our slave races had similar lessons to teach us. So, shocking the entire empire, Empress Velchi hath called the 17 native species homeworld governors before her, informed them that they were now the provisional rulers of 17 free solar systems, and humbly asked them to share their wisdom with us. Then she abdicated, paving the way for a multi-species federated alliance. 3 species, the Nedeki, Kardine and Polatha, accepted her request. 12 others have since signed non-aggression treaties but prefer to keep us at arm's length. The Hamak and the Quithun, understandably but unfortunately, are still not prepared to abandon revenge. But we'll get to that next semester. As the students began to gather their pads and file out, one human female piped up, "Professor, maybe this is a dumb question, but what does P. Hen Helga Needy mean?" The professor chuckled. "It's P. Henny Helga Needy, and it's somewhat broken old Alvar. Understandable, since it was the product of a mere week of learning. But all of us knew what Victus meant. The first lesson is free.